I remember in Washtenaw, there was a person who was arrested and the family member of the person didn't want the watchman to show up.
Right, and they honored that request and didn't show up.
Yes,
Okay. And, we talked about the 21st, correct? Well, we didn't talk about it, but we kind of got ahead. There was a training later in June at the unit residence.
yes, so June 28th training?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay. Now, this training is not recorded, correct?
correct.
It's not recorded because something happened with the recorder in the process of that training event.
This is the one where you had the primary and the backup. And the primary, we lost that because of the OPSEC. And then the backup, there was some type of malfunction or it didn't turn on. I didn't have any recording when the backup got back to me.
After this training, we go into July. And now another group is set up, correct?
Are you referring to the ghost group?
No, what I'm referring to is, and I guess I'll slow it down. In July, we have the Wolverine Watchman main chat, correct?
Yes,
There's still a vetting chat in July.
yes,
Pete Musical is not part of the vetting chat.
that's correct.
There's a QRF team chat in July, correct?
Correct,
Pete Musical is not part of that.
correct. The QRF chat got renamed the Bonfire Parties chat in July.
Right. There's a leadership chat still in July.
Correct,
Pete Musical is not part of that.
that's correct,
There's a fuck around, find out chat in July.
correct,
Pete Musical is not part of that.
correct,
There's a brother men chat in July.
correct,
Pete Musical is not part of that.
correct,
And there's an Armory chat that he's a part of.
that's correct.
There have been several discussions about Cambria, Wisconsin, correct?
Correct,
Pete Musical is not present at Cambria, Wisconsin.
that's correct,
Then there's the 7/18 meeting in Peoples, Ohio.
correct,
Dan is tasked to go to that Cambria, Ohio meeting.
yes, sir,
Pete Musical doesn't go to that meeting.
that's correct,
Adam Fox shows up at that meeting,
that's correct.
at the almost very end of that meeting.
He certainly wasn't there at the beginning. I know he came late. And it was a 3-hour meeting. Probably came for the last half.
As a matter of fact, after the Peoples meeting, there was I think a chat that Mr. Musical was not a part of, where it's described as I don't want to quote because I don't have that exhibit in front of me, but it wasn't really an impressive meeting based on.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of discussion amongst Barry Croft, Adam Fox, anybody who had knowledge that they didn't actually select an attack plan to move going forward. Everybody had ideas and they were throwing out there, but they didn't come to a consensus.
Okay. Now, at some point, people in that group are even now concerned with Barry Croft.
There's some statements of concern about Barry Croft, yes.
They want to disassociate themselves from Barry Croft.
Some people thought Barry Croft might be a Fed.
Correct. There's an August 9th training at Munich, correct?
Yes,
Pete Musical's not there.
correct.
There was a training in Fowlerville that Pete Musical was not at.
July 26th. That's correct.
In September, Dan is tasked to contact, Pete and kind of talk to him and see where his head is at because he's not been around. Is that a fair assessment?
There was a lot going on in September between Pete and Dan. Mr. Musico had accused Dan of being a federal source. And so we extracted Dan from the Wolverine Watchman. And we were trying to move him away because it was too dangerous. But Pete was talking to him and reaching out, and there was recorded phone calls. So we certainly wanted to know where Pete's head was at, but the tasking was more for Dan's own safety.
On September 4th, 2020, did you text to Pete? Yeah, I like that. Maybe teed up with Pete and treat him like the leader he claims to be. Seems like Joe is just copying what Pete says now.
So I recognize those text messages. I believe they're from Jason Chambers. They're between Jason and Dan.
Would you like to see them? You believe these?
Sure. Yes, that'd be great.
May I push the witness?
Yes.
Yes, so I recognize the message there. It's from September 4th, and that's Jason Chambers. It's a message between Jason and CHS Dan. I became aware of it during the discovery process.
And in correlation with the exhibits that have been offered into evidence, that is around the time that Dan's making those phone calls that we heard recorded with Pete in September, correct?
Yes,
And he tells Dan to treat him like the leader Pete claims to be, are his exact quote.
yes.
And at that point, the Wolverine Watchmen original members had disassociated themselves from Pete Musical.
So a lot of the Wolverine Watchmen, a key group of the QRF, the Ghost Group then, had left from the Wolverine Watchmen to the Ghost Group, and then others had continued on to the to Adam Fox. So a lot of there were still some members of the Wolverine Watchmen, but it certainly wasn't the same group it was in June and July.
In those chats that Pete was not in, there were specific instructions to not discuss things with Pete.
Know that Joe Morrison was tasked with basically managing Pete, making sure he didn't say things too extreme or draw attention to them or scare off new members. So it wouldn't be, I mean, I don't have a specific quote in mind, but I think what you're saying is, I remember generally speaking, them discussing not bringing Pete into things.
Yeah, that's true. We'll get to specific quotes with Dan.
Okay.
And the group was upset with Pete for continuing to go to protests.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, there was one protest, it was described as a pedophile protest. I'm not sure if that's actually what it was. But Pete requested members to go, and they talked about it and said they're not going.
Yeah, so Paul Beller had brought up, and the concept after the shift in focus in May was to not be as not be out in public, to be more of a shadows group and not draw as much attention. And so Pete Musico and Joe Morrison had basically ignored that and gone to some protests and publicly been out recruiting and posting online in July and August. And that upset a lot of the members because they thought they had a consensus.
After Cambridge, there was talk about Luther, Michigan, correct?
Yes.
That was a farming property that was owned by the Ty Garvin family.
It was a hunting property that Ty Garvin owned.
Mr. Musical never went to Luther.
That's correct.
He never went on on any surveillance that the Luther team went on.
Correct. Yes.
Although, we've talked about the Anarchist Cookbook, and we saw some pictures of the chapter on explosives, correct?
Correct.
There was at some point, the group that went to Luther was discussing acquiring explosives.
That's correct.
They didn't try and acquire explosives from Pete, did they?
I don't know about Adam Fox's discussions with Pete. There was certainly discussions we didn't have coverage of. The other Wolverine Watchmen, like Ty Garvin, Caleb Franks, I think it's fair to say they weren't trying to acquire explosives from Pete.
And as a matter of fact, the FBI inserted another undercover agent who posed as an explosive expert.
Yes, we had a bomb maker who could acquire explosives.
When the search of Mr. Musical's residence was conducted, you were briefed on that search, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. No live explosives were located,
That's correct.
and that would include, the hand grenade that was referenced was located, correct?
It was a grenade body. Yes,
No C4 was ever located.
that's correct.
When you got there was no evidence that the property was booby trapped.
That's correct.
There was no cache of hidden weapons around the property.
Well, we didn't find any, but also we didn't dig for any. We didn't have any intel on where to dig or where the hidden weapons could be. But it's definitely fair to say we did not find any hidden weapons.
Early on in this investigation, you got information from Dan that Pete was saying things to provoke a responsible law enforcement.
That's what I saw on the main chat. And yes, that's what he said at the protest.
He was he was referenced, often it's subjective. He was called Crazy Pete at times by members of the group.
Yes, definitely.
On 12/10/2020, you engaged in an interview with Stephen Robeson.
So that's the day that I went to Wisconsin. We executed a search warrant, and then I participated in an interview, which turned into an interrogation of Stephen Robeson.
That was a very lengthy interrogation, correct? 5 hours.
Yes, 5-hour interrogation.
Have you had an opportunity to at least listen to the clips that we provided?
I did.
Okay. Do they appear to be fair and accurate of the entire of portions of the entire 5-hour interview?
Yes, there was 2 clips I listened to.
At any point in that interview, did you speak to Mr. Robeson about what options 1, 2, and 3 were?
Yes,
Option 1 was the home run. It indicates that, and this was the goal, that Robeson would not have to testify. Robeson will not be used as a witness because defendants will flip and he will not be needed.
yes,
Now, in fairness, that was in regards to another investigation, correct?
yes. So this was all investigation involving witness tampering, felon in possession, and the FBI had a domestic terrorism case on Stephen Robeson.
Option 2 was prosecution's witness. The prosecution decided that Robeson testimony would be needed, and explains that would be dependent on the defense making quote unquote outlandish claims.
Something to that effect, yes. I think, did you say number 2 was the prosecution witness?
Yep.
Yes, yeah. So the first one is not needed. The second one is the prosecution witness.
Option 3 was the defense witness. And you told that this was the worst option for him, that he would be called by the defense.
I talked to him about that, yes, and I talked about how I thought it was something that he didn't want.
You discussed forms that the FBI has, and you had Mr. Robeson sign FBI forms pertaining to truthfulness.
Yes.
Consent to forensically examine his cell phone, a non-disclosure statement, and a consent form to examine his Facebook account.
Yes, I also provided him the 1001 form, and 18 USC 1001 is admonishments that lying to a federal agent is a crime.
Right, and you said that that was the truthfulness form, and it's designed to lock you in, that it's a felony to lie to the FBI. And you actually joked that this is the Mike Flynn one.
Yes. I mean, I don't know if I would call it a joke. I was trying to make sure he fully understood the form. I read it to him, and it was important that he knew not to lie to the FBI.
Points in that interview, you and Mr. Robeson talked about Peebles. Correct? Peebles, Ohio.
Yes.
And again, Mr. Robeson was not there. Excuse me, Mr. Musical was not there.
Yes, Mr. Musico was not Peebles.
You talked about Dublin, correct?
Yes,
And Mr. Musical was not in Dublin.
correct.
You tell Mr. Robeson that one of the tactics that you use are to list a bunch of witnesses to confuse the defense.
I talked about my strategy to keep sources alive, and that is my strategy. The whole point is that a case doesn't rely on one particular witness. So in gang cases, if one source or one person can take down the entire gang, that puts their life in danger. So what I told Mr. Robeson, and what I typically do in gang cases, is I try to get as many separate witnesses as possible, and I try and get the defendant to flip, because if the testimony in the case relies on one person, that person can be killed and their life is in danger in order for the case to go away. So yes, I described that. Mr. Robeson was concerned about his safety and wanted to discuss what the FBI was willing to do.
And he was eventually indicted by the FBI, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You told Mr. Robeson that the FBI's job or intent was to disrupt and dismantle the Wolverine Watchmen.
Yes, absolutely.
You told him that once Luther happened, everything became real.
I don't remember using those words, but I think that's a fair statement. The threat was real and couldn't be avoided at that time.
Yeah, my approach was been marked Defense Proposed Exhibit W.
Yes,
So do you recognize what's in documents Defense Proposed Exhibit W?
I do. This is Exhibit W from the preliminary exam, and it was found, I believe, on Pete Musico's phone.
Yeah, and I move for admission.
any objection?
No objection, Judge.
I assume none of the defense counsel has objection.
What is it? I have no objection to that, Your Honor.
Admitted. What number?
Okay, that's what I thought, W.
Yeah. W? Okay. W is admitted.
Your Honor, for purposes of, when I do exhibits, you want me to just, we're gonna have, I don't know how, you want me to do like a double letter? Or I just don't want there to be confusion when we get around to me doing a couple exhibits, how we might number them.
A double letter, well,
I could do double, he could do triple, and
yeah,
that might make it easier.
or let him do double, you do triple, since we're working. on it.
Perfect. Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
These names were added to the flag at a later date that we saw on the Wolverine Watchmen.
Yes,
And you think you agreed foundationally that this was on Pete Musical's page.
Yes,
Flag has a list of names. It indicates one, his name was Michael Hastings.
yes,
His name was Rick Cutshaw.
yes,
His name was Gary Willis.
yes,
His name was Eric Gardner.
yes,
His name was Frank Ordonez.
yes,
His name was Kelly Thomas.
yes,
Her name was Vicky Weaver.
yes,
His name was Duncan Limp.
yes,
His name was Oscar Grant.
yes,
Her name was Breonna Taylor.
yes,
His name was Robert Lavoy Finkel.
yes.
I just want to have for the question.
Ballard,
Thank you, Your Honor.
Agent, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Counselor.
I want to back up to what brought you to investigate the watch, okay? And now, and I realize this has been covered, but we're separate cases, right? So I've got to, some of this ground I've got to trudge again.
Sure, whatever you need, Counselor.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Dan goes on to the Wolverine Wasserman Facebook page. Is that correct?
Yes,
And he sees, he's looking for a like-minded group to do training. Is that correct?
I know he's looking for a like-minded group. I don't know if he visited the page or if Facebook just suggests groups. I believe, and you can ask him when he comes, if it just suggested a group and he clicked join the group.
Okay, fair enough, right? I'll be the first to admit, I'm not a computer genius. I'm not a social media person, so I'm not trying to
Sure.
harp on something very specific, but somehow Dan gets onto their page. Is that correct?
Yes,
And he goes through a series of questions. Is that correct? Like vetting questions?
yes, there's a few questions he was asked.
Okay. So again, and if you don't know this, you know, I understand, but I'll tell you I don't, right? So are these automatic questions that just pop up and you answer? Or are these, was somebody at the other side writing him a question, getting an answer, writing him a question?
I don't know. I mean, I believe they're two different things. I believe when you join a Facebook page, it typically has a series of automated questions, and I don't know if that was the case here. And then in this case, I believe somebody personally asked him questions after he joined the page. So he may or may not have answered some automated questions. And then, but at some point, somebody asked him questions and he responded.
Okay. Do you know who that was?
I don't know.
Okay. So once he gets vetted into this group, correct? And if I use the wrong phraseology, please correct me.
Yes, no
Okay.
problem.
Once he gets vetted in, he sees, or what he represents later is that he sees things that are alarming. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what were these things? Do you know?
What really concerned him was Mr. Musico had told the group to download the OnX hunting app. And then there was discussion about using the OnX hunting app to track down the addresses and property owned by law enforcement officers for the purpose of reverse red flag warrants on their house.
Okay. So he sees this on the Facebook page.
No, he sees it on Wire once he joins Wire.
Okay, we've heard a lot about Wire, and I'm going to tangent off here just for a minute. Is this a readily available app that I can get on my phone?
Yes, sir.
Is it perfectly legal?
Yes,
communications on it are not unlawful. Is that correct? Take out the content, but my communication with someone else on wire, that interaction is not unlawful. Is that correct?
Well, what's legal and not is based on the person's intent and actions, but you
Right.
can certainly download wire and there's no problem with it. You can say whatever you want on wire.
Correct. And I guess that's where I'm going, right? The fact that somebody has wire and is using wire to communicate to somebody else, regardless of the content, right? I'm not talking about the content of what they're saying or what they're hearing, but the use of this app is not unlawful. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so Dan goes on to wire and sees this information.
That's correct.
And then, as I understand the timeline, he reaches out to this officer. Correct me if I'm wrong, it's Ramirez, correct?
Yes, Mount Morris Township
Mount
Police
Morris-
Officer.
Mount
Dave
Morris
Ramirez.
Township Police Officer Ramirez, and he says, hey, I saw this information. Is that correct?
Yes,
Correct it in context, right? Okay. And then Officer Ramirez takes it to his sergeant, correct?
he takes it to his sergeant at the FBI. So he has a separate sergeant, as I understand it. So he brought it to Brett Orvis because he worked with the FBI.
Okay. And you, as part of this task force, work with Brett Orvis, is that correct?
That's correct.
And he's a sergeant with Mount Morris, that's his rank, pay, place, and
Yes.
employment, et cetera?
Yes,
Okay. And then you look at, you meet Dan then?
so then what happened is, Brett Orvis took a screen capture of the Wolverine Watchman Facebook page, which he'd received from Officer Ramirez. And
Okay.
he sent it to me and said, this might be something you're interested in. And I asked for the phone number of the complainant and the name to have a meeting. And so I received it, forwarded to me from Brett Orvis, and then me and my partner set up the meeting with Dan.
Okay, so then you get a hold of Dan. Dan comes to wherever you met him, right? FBI headquarters, I'm assuming in Flint.
Yeah, FBI office in Flint.
Okay. And then what happens?
So we asked him what his concern was, why he was coming to law enforcement. He describes the Onyx hunting app and the reverse red flags. And then I asked him for consent to search his phone. And is there anything he has that can corroborate the story and show what types of communications were going on? And so he gave his phone to me and my partner, and we scrolled through it and saw the communications. And then we asked for permission to photograph the communications that were on the phone, and then we did.
And these communications dealt with threats to law enforcement?
Well, there was some general memes and propaganda about killing police officers, and then there was schematics of machine guns, and there was discussion of explosives and detonation distances and things like that.
Did you see threats to law enforcement?
I viewed all of that to be.
That wasn't my question. My question was, did you see threats to law enforcement? It's a simple yes or no question.
I described to you what I saw.
Okay. Did you see a threat to a law enforcement officer?
Yes,
You did. How many?
they were general threats about targeting police. No law enforcement officer's name was there. We had the exhibits up on the screen, so that's what I saw. No more, no less.
Okay. Did you take photographs of these encrypted threats to law enforcement?
I took photographs of all the encrypted chats that were available on his phone, whether they're calling him a threat or not. I took photographs of them.
Okay. So were these threats, the memes that we saw earlier, the tombstones with "Look, son, a good cop"? Is that the kind of stuff that you saw?
Yes, that was one of them. Yes.
Distasteful as it might be to law enforcement officers, how can you distinguish that as propaganda versus a distasteful meme?
I'm not trying to distinguish that as propaganda.
What makes it a threat?
I'm not trying to say that that meme was a threat.
Okay, then what did you see that was a threat to law enforcement?
I saw that there was a group that was organized. They had their own secure OPSEC, and they had a plan in place to respond and attack law enforcement as a QRF. And they were demonstrating the use of that plan and the location, the ping, and how to do a location drop so that the QRF could respond to contact and fight law enforcement.
So would it be correct to say that, in your opinion, you saw numerous actual threats to law enforcement?
I saw the establishment of a group with the QRF to attack law enforcement. I don't know. if it
I'm
be-
really not trying to play
Judge,
semantics with you.
I'm sorry, I'm objecting because I think there's a lot of cutting off, and if the witness is asked a question, I'm asking the court to instruct lawyers to let him answer. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Agent, is there more to that answer?
So I was talking about the QRFs. So whatever you call the QRF response, that's what concerned me, is the QRF response to contact with law enforcement.
I believe in your very opening testimony at this trial, you identified that one of your tasks or assignments with the FBI, and I don't know if this is current or this was previous, but I think you said you were on the evidence response team. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
What is that?
So the evidence response team, it's an ancillary duty, so it's an extra duty. So in the FBI, your special agent is your main job. And then you can sign up for extra duties in which you get called out. So the evidence response team is one of those extra duties in which you bag and tag evidence, you collect forensic evidence, so hairs, fibers, blood spatter. Part of what I do is crime scene sketching, so I teach that for the evidence response team.
Okay. And I'm sure bagging and tagging, collecting evidence, right, is an important part of this?
I mean, yeah, it can be important. It should
Okay.
be, yeah.
Now, I'm curious. I saw memes. I'm wondering where the evidence is of these numerous threats to law enforcement that you saw. Do we have those?
There's a lot of evidence of the QRFs.
That's not the question, Agent. I'm not talking about the QRFs. I'm talking about numerous threats to law enforcement. Do we have numerous threats to law enforcement?
I'm sorry, what do you consider to be a threat?
Well, what do you consider a threat to law enforcement?
I consider QRFs to be a threat to law enforcement,
Based on what?
based on the description that they're going to attack law enforcement when called upon.
When called upon, when they're policing the police, as we heard, correct?
Yeah.
And you saw all of this in these few things that you looked at? Right there on that day that you met Dan, right? On
The first
what day was it? The 17th, is that correct? Right, that was the day you met Dan? On March 17th, you saw all of these things that you're describing?
So the first day I met Dan, I saw references to the QRF and the location drop in the pings. I didn't see all of these exhibits that are in the binder describing the QRFs at that.
So if you had testified previously and said that on the 17th, you saw numerous communications on an encrypted application involving violence against police officers, is that actually what you saw on the 17th? Because it doesn't sound like it to me.
I think it's a fair summary of my interpretation of what I saw, but the exact things that I saw are not in question. I took photographs of them. I'm not disputing anything that is on those photographs. Those photographs are exactly what I saw.
Okay. So I guess what we're arguing about then is whether or not these are threats. Is that correct?
And Judge, I'm gonna object here.
What's the objection?
These are,
What's the question?
My question is, is that what we're talking about?
Well, we
The
said-
difference between what is a threat and what is propaganda or a meme or any of these things?
the question I was objecting to, judges, is that what we're arguing about? I think it's the lawyer arguing with the witness.
I'll withdraw, Your Honor. I'll move on.
Or rephrase it.
I believe you testified that as part of this initial viewing, you saw unlawful weapons. Is that correct on the 17th?
I saw a schematic of auto sear, which makes a rifle into a machine gun.
Is a schematic a weapon?
The schematic was of a weapon, but it wasn't a physical weapon. It was a drawing, like a sketch, like an engineering drawing for how to make a weapon.
Is it unlawful to have this?
No,
Is it unlawful to have this anarchist cookbook we've heard about?
no, not unlawful.
Can I go on Amazon and buy it?
Yes,
First Amendment speech, right?
sure.
Okay. So what was it about seeing this that aroused your suspicion?
Was the fact that there was an organized group that was using OPSEC and they were discussing illegal activity, being the machine gun and the explosives, and they were discussing what I perceive to be as their intent to kill law enforcement officers.
That's your perception of their intent, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
And you would agree with me that you're in no position to testify as to what their intent was.
That's correct. I can't tell
Okay.
you what's in their head.
Thank you. So the next thing I think we talked about was, or the next thing that took place generally was the vetting, I think you said, of Dan. Is that correct?
Well, the vetting of Dan had occurred before I met him.
Oh, it did. Okay, then I apologize. I have my dates mixed up.
Oh,
So,
I'm sorry, you're talking about my vetting of Dan?
yes,
Okay, yes. After I met him, then the FBI, I did his background check.
after the 17th.
Yes, yes.
And what was that background check? What did it consist of?
We ran his criminal history, and then
Okay.
we have to look through all of our holdings. We have to run his name into the FBI database. So if we're looking for any phone contact he would have had with any other subjects, where his name is popping up on any cases. Then we'd look into his publicly available information, his Facebook or his military history, his background. So we just do a basic scrubbing of what currently exists online for Dan.
Okay, and so do you run his financials?
No.
No?
that's
So
correct.
it's not relevant if he's in financial need?
No, it is. That's something that we have to note, and we have to track that as a source handler. But we don't have any particular way to run his financials. I don't have a search warrant. I don't have subpoenas. There is no legal method of obtaining his financial information at that time.
Did you ask him about it?
Yes.
And what did he say?
Told me where he worked.
Where did he tell you he worked?
Told me he worked as a contractor for a service that ultimately delivered mail for the US Postal Service.
So he held the contracts.
No, it's a trucking company. And so he was a truck driver and his company was a contractor of the US Postal Service.
Okay. You said you checked into his military background, is that correct?
Yes.
What'd you find?
Find that he had served overseas. He'd been honorably discharged.
Okay, what does that mean? Do you know?
Generally speaking, it just means that he didn't commit a crime or do anything that would cause the US military concern. That They
Okay,
allowed
so
him
it's,
to serve his contract.
okay, so basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, in your understanding, right? I understand you testified earlier you were not in the military. But is it your understanding that if John Q. Public enlists in the Army goes into the Army, does his 4 years of typing or whatever he does, and doesn't get in trouble for anything, and comes to the end of his contract, he's honorably discharged?
I think that's fair, yes.
Okay. And that's what we found out about Dan. He was honorably discharged. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Find out anything else out?
He didn't have a criminal history. I found out about his personal life, his family. He had a daughter. I found out where he lived, what he drove, things like that.
Back to the military, if we could, for a moment. Is that all you found out about his military service?
That's
Find out if he
all I can
was.
recall. If
Oh.
there's anything specific, I'm not sure what you're referencing.
Well, I think we heard in opening that he was wounded.
Oh, he told me he was wounded, but I didn't verify that with the military.
What kind of wounds did he tell you he had received?
I know he
If you
had,
recall.
yeah, he had some sort of pin in his leg, and I know he had some back issues. And I don't know, what the results, if those happened in combat, or how he just described that he was pretty beat up, and that's where I left it.
Okay. Did he tell you about a traumatic brain injury?
During the course, in fact, yeah, early on, he said he might have problems remembering specific dates. And he's not super good with recall at times, is what he.
So his memory is questionable. Is that right?
I didn't find it to be questionable once we started working with him, but he was concerned that when he was going in, he might not be a good source. He might not remember a license plate, or he might not remember or recall something. But during the course of the investigation, I didn't find that to be an issue. But it was one thing that we certainly, as soon as he left, I tried to debrief him as soon as possible and get all the information right then.
So, but if he didn't remember something, how would you know that he didn't remember it?
I guess like a license plate, if I asked him what the license plate was and he didn't remember, then he would say, I don't remember the license plate.
Okay.
If he didn't recall any particular license plate and didn't tell me anything and I didn't think to ask of it, then I would not know.
Okay. You didn't do any kind of psychological workup on him before you put him into this, did you?
No.
Okay. So every time, and I'm asking this, I'm not asserting this, right? Every time he interacted or went to these meetings or functions or trainings, he was debriefed?
Well, I tried to do it, but like I was explaining earlier to the other attorney,
Mr. Johnson.
sometimes, yes, Mr. Johnson, sometimes if there's a quick cycle and a quick turnover and they're doing one thing and then they're going to the next, I would debrief on a few instances out in time. Like if I
Okay.
didn't have time to meet with them, or if it was too dangerous, or like, for instance, Wisconsin was a 2-day training. So, I didn't have the time to meet with him after the first day. He was still embedded, and I would have to meet with him after the second day of training.
Okay, and I think part of that, I think you testified, right? They went to Detroit the one evening, right, in May, and then the very next day they go to Flint. So that would be one debriefing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Try to, because again, just the logistics of it. Would that be correct in my assertion that
Yes.
just the logistics didn't give time for that specific individual debriefing? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you did all the debriefings?
Me, my partner, and then Agent Harris here was present, but I certainly was there with Agent Chambers for the majority of the debriefings.
The majority, but not all?
That's correct.
Okay. So do you document these debriefings?
Yes, sir.
How do you document them?
We type them into this computer program in the FBI we call Delta. It's our source reporting software. And then, of course, it gives an acronym, FD form. It's called an FD 1023, and that's a source report. And then that FD 1023 source report goes into the case file and then becomes discovery.
Okay, so when you debrief Dan, then you enter this information in the, what'd you call it? The Delta?
Yeah, so we write a report into Delta.
Okay, and now, again, I'm just trying to understand. Then that generates this form, this 1023.
That's correct.
Okay. How many do you think you wrote?
434, I believe.
Okay,
I mean, personally, it's between me and the other handling agent, Agent Chambers,
okay,
wrote those. So those are the source reports that Dan generated. But to clarify, a lot of those source reports weren't based on debriefs from Dan. A lot of those source reports were actually taking information out of Wire and then taking the Wire content, which we're able to view through Dan's username, and putting them into the source report, as opposed to sitting down with, we didn't sit down with him 434 times or whatever.
okay.
But there's 434 some odd reports like that
All right.
were generated.
And I apologize. I thought I had pulled this out.
So you generated 400 of these? Is that correct?
For Dan, source reports under Dan, so Jason Chambers and myself were the authors of those reports.
How many did you author?
Jason Chambers certainly authored the most. He authored a lot of the wire chats, and I did most of the in-person debriefs. Mine was probably under 20.
Under 20. So out of this 400, you did 20
Yes,
and Jason Chambers did the rest.
yes, and those are rough estimates.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll hear from Jason Chambers. I don't know. He wrote the majority of these. Why would he be writing them instead of you?
Well, we had different roles. So my primary role in the investigation was to obtain the electronic evidence. So for this case, I called it the Elsher Library. So I was handing off the recording devices and then retrieving them. And then I was creating the interceptee list and documenting who was captured in each recording and then uploading those recordings into evidence.
Okay. So do you have your significant people event up there behind your significant timeline? Is that still there?
So I've got the significant events. I've got the subjects of investigation and the Wolverine module.
Okay. All right. If I may approach just briefly, Your Honor. Okay, well, we'll start with this one. On that top line, on the far right, who is that? Right there.
Yeah, this is Jada Morrison.
And who is she?
She's Joe Morrison's wife and Pete Musico's daughter.
Okay. If you know, is Pete married?
Yes,
What is his wife's name?
Crystal.
Crystal. Crystal and Pete Musico, correct?
Yes.
I think we saw an exhibit up here, and if I'm mistaken, please tell me, but it identified a Facebook of Crystal Pete Musico. Is that correct?
Yes.
Who was posting that content, Crystal or Pete?
Well, in my opinion, it was Pete.
In your opinion, but you don't know, do you?
Well, I reviewed the content.
Okay, but it had both names on it, didn't it?
The username, yes, it included Crystal Pete.
Okay. And I believe we heard testimony from you that Jada Morrison, if I'm wrong, please tell me, that you attributed her to being somehow a part of the founding of this. Is that correct?
I don't think I ever said that, but she certainly was influential in the group. And she shared a lot of the same ideology.
Shared a lot of the same ideology. So how do we know when we're getting some of these posts on Facebook and et cetera, who's doing?
Which Facebook are you talking about?
The Facebook of the Wolverine Watchman.
So when you post on the Wolverine Watchman Facebook page, it'll tell you which Facebook account posts it. So for
Okay.
instance, George Bunyan, Joe Morrison's, which is his personal Facebook, it'll tell you who posts it. And then you've got Pete and Crystal's Facebook page. And then when that was taken down, it was Pete Musico's Facebook page.
So let me give you an example of what I'm trying to comprehend here. And this is kind of a hypothetical, but I'm hoping it clarifies with you what I'm trying to understand.
Sure.
I have a son. I'm divorced. Sometimes my son comes to visit me. I have a phone. It's sitting on the counter. My son says, "Hey, mom sent you," or mom says, whatever, right? Flights change, this, that, pick up, whatever. And I say, you know what? Write her back. Tell her I said whatever. When she gets that comes from my phone, doesn't it?
Yes.
Unless he specifically says, "Hey, mom," she has no idea who wrote that, does she?
That's correct.
In fact, she would assume it's me, correct?
Yes.
So we really have no idea who wrote some of this stuff, do we?
So there's no way that I can tell you who actually typed the physical messages.
Okay, fair enough. So when we put up this stuff and we say, this was Joe Morrison who said this, or this was Pete Musico that said this, or this was this person, Dan Harris, we don't really know, do we? Fair? Yes or no?
All I can tell you is that it's coming from their account.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, one of your assignments is, and I know I'm gonna butcher this or mislabel it, but gang-related investigations, is that correct?
Well, it isn't currently, but for about 5 years, I was on a violent crimes against children task force in which
Okay.
we investigated juvenile sex trafficking, which frequently involved gangs. So that's how I ran across task force officer Brett Orbis, who specialized in gangs.
And I'm not trying to trip you up, I'm
Yeah.
legitimately asking, right? So you have a background in gang work, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Were there gangs operating in the Flint or the greater Flint or whatever your investigative area geographically was that would be understood or recognizably similar to the Bloods or the Crips or the Latin Kings?
In the Flint area, there's a lot of neighborhood-based gangs, so they're less organized than the Bloods and the Crips.
Okay.
Some call themselves similar names, but they don't use the same colors. So generally speaking, Flint is neighborhood-based street violence and not the same like Bloods, Crips hierarchy that you'd see like in LA.
Okay. As part of your understanding of this, I'm sure you must have taken training in some kind of gang structures. Is that safe to say?
Yes,
And they have this hierarchy of leadership that we've heard about, is that correct?
yes,
And there's someone at the top, right? Some numero uno, if you will. Is that correct?
a lot of times it's somebody who's in prison.
Really? Okay, fair enough. But there is that one person, is that correct?
It for your standard organized gang, yes, but there's a lot of different types of gangs. So like
Fair
for
enough.
the street-based violence that you see in Flint and then in Detroit, and a lot of like the smaller, Lansing, Pontiac, a lot of times those gangs are very disjointed and there's a lot of drama and discussions over leadership. So in a traditional Bloods Crips type of case, there's a much more hierarchical leadership, but in the cases I'm used to in Flint, it's decentralized and much more chaotic.
So no real established leader?
A lot of times, force and violence is used to establish some sort of temporary leadership until more force and violence changes that structure.
Okay. Excuse me. Is there, that goes along with this leadership, is there some type of general orders or rules or something along those lines that these gangs attribute to?
There can be.
Would there be some type of punishment, if you will, for not adhering to what leadership told you?
There can be.
Is that your understanding of a generalization?
Well, there's certainly many instances in which gang members break the rules and it isn't enforced. It's all based on the relationship among the members. In the more organized gangs, like for instance, a motorcycle gang is much more hierarchical and they'll enforce the rules a lot more than they would in a neighborhood-based street gang.
Okay. So if a leader says you have to come and the punishment for not coming is we take you off of Facebook, not really a big punishment, would you agree?
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have much clout.
Okay. When these guys are communicating, these guys being the watchmen, and I believe you testified that they all had separate nicknames. Is that correct? Usernames? Is
Yes,
that right?
generally speaking, yes.
Is that uncommon for groups of people to use nicknames?
I'm familiar with nicknames on teams and in gangs, and so I don't think it's uncommon.
Okay, so when we say these guys had nicknames or handles or aliases, we can't necessarily say that's solely for the purpose of OPSEC, can we? Because we kept hearing about OPSEC, 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 but it could just be how they refer to each other. Is that correct?
Sure.
Okay. And I'm sorry that I'm having to work through this. Again, we've got 3 councils, so don't want to overdo a lot of things or redo. We saw a lot of pictures of members of the Watchmen displaying, standing with their long guns. Is that correct?
I don't know. I guess a lot is general. Saw a few pictures.
A few pictures, right? They're standing, there was some of them in front of the Capitol. Is that correct?
Sure.
Carrying firearms.
Yes.
We saw some of them inside the Capitol. Is that correct?
Yes.
We saw pictures of them in their kits, as you called it, correct?
Yes.
And then I think we saw some evidence, some things entered, just pictures of the kits, right? Just sitting there in a photograph,
Yes. Sir.
correct? Are those illegal to possess and own?
No.
Patches that we saw, illegal to possess and own?
No.
If I want to call myself an infidel, is that illegal?
No.
If I want to take the American flag patch and turn it upside down, is that illegal?
Certainly not.
The firearms that we saw, were they illegal?
No,
No way to know if they were altered in any way, right?
we do a test of the firearms when we obtain them for evidence, and I don't believe any of them were altered.
So none of these firearms that we've seen were illegal, correct?
Well, there was pictures of illegal firearms, but these defendants weren't carrying them.
Okay, so Joe, Pete, Paul, you have no pictures of them carrying illegal firearms that you know of. Is that correct?
I think that's accurate, yes.
Okay. And we talked about their kits, right? That's legal,
Yes.
correct? Carrying first aid stuff, legal.
Certainly.
And I'm gonna cover this really quick. This is a little bit out of place, right? But I'm just gonna talk about this. Dublin, Ohio, Joe Morrison, did he go?
No,
Vac Shack meeting, did he go?
no,
Cambria in Wisconsin, did he go?
no,
Peoples, Ohio, did he go?
no.
Okay. And like I said, I apologize to you. I'm not trying to trip you up. I don't mean to go tremendously out of order here, right? But I'm trying to follow down your testimony as it went and not backtrack on things that we've already done. There was evidence put in of this manual, correct? I think you called it the Boog manual, right?
Oh, yes.
Is that, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, this is the one from March 22nd that Joe sent out.
Okay.
That's what I'm recalling.
Okay. And it was a number of pages and we had the pages up here on the screen, correct?
Yes, sir.
Anywhere in that book, was there anything that you would say was illegal?
Well, book itself can't be illegal, but I think the promotion of insurrection and violence against the government is a concept that's illegal, but a book and saying those things is not, like, that's not a threat. I don't
Okay.
consider the book to be a threat or like a book that in itself is not legal.
Okay, so the fact that Mr. Morrison may or may not, because we already established we don't know who sends stuff out. So whoever sent this book out into the world, the mere possession of this book or this manual is not unlawful. Would you agree?
I'd agree.
Would you agree that under your understanding, and I'm not trying to put a legal lamp on this, right? But you would consider that his First Amendment or her First Amendment right to just have this idea,
Absolutely.
correct? And correct me if I'm wrong, right? But there has been dissent in this country for quite a while. Would you agree?
Yes,
Would you agree that there are people on both sides of almost every major political issue that are adamant and vehement about their position? Would you agree?
dissent is protected.
Dissent is protected. So if they're saying, hey, look, and they being anybody on one side of an aisle or the other, saying, hey, this is wrong, and this is why it's wrong. Take the abortion issue, correct? Right? There are people who are adamantly opposed to abortion, yes or no?
Yes,
There are people who are staunch believers in the right to choose. Would you agree?
yes,
So the fact that they're sending out, let's just say, the anti-abortion people, if they're sending out pictures of aborted fetuses and they're trying to sing this point home, protected free speech?
absolutely.
Okay. So if they're standing there, these abortion, these anti-abortion activists, right, with their destroyed fetuses signs, and they're making, this staunch opposition to it, is that propaganda or they trying to communicate something?
I think it could be both. Propaganda is also protected speech.
Okay, oh, so then when you say that Joe or Pete or Paul was sending out propaganda, you would agree they were not violating anything by sending this out, would you?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
Okay. Very good. When, and I know Mr. Johnson touched on this, and I'm going to try and be brief on this. When Joe Morrison went to the Capitol to protest, did he, in your understanding of what took place, violate any law?
Well, that would depend on his intentions when he went to the Capitol.
And we covered this, correct me if I'm wrong, you don't know what his intentions were.
That's correct.
So if he goes and he stands there and he, as Mr. Johnson said, right, there was protocols at the time, gets his temperature taken, answers the question, have you been exposed? And he did, and they say, okay, go on in. And he goes on in and they allow him to go in with his rifle and his kit. In your understanding, has he violated the law in any way?
I don't think so. I think it's
Okay.
fair to say he was legal.
And he was doing what? Protesting?
Yes,
Okay, so in your understanding, because we put this up on the screen too, right? All these calls that Joe and Pete made to the governor's office, do you recall that exhibit?
I do.
Right, and it showed this call, this date and time, this complaint, this. They were trying to get resolution to issues, would you agree?
They were certainly trying to get the governor's attention.
Okay, and would you agree that there was probably, and I'm not trying to narrow down a number here, right? But would you agree that half the state probably was mad and half the state supported her at that time?
There was a lot of people on both sides of the aisle.
Thank you. And these guys, by calling the governor that many times, not really OPSEC in calling that, right?
Well, they were calling the governor before the coronavirus. So
Okay.
that was, they're two separate things.
Agreed. But they had issues at that time, correct?
Yes,
As do any number of citizens here in the state of Michigan have issues.
absolutely.
And you would say that, I don't know if it was Governor Whitmer or if this has always been the system, but that call center is set up for citizens or people in general. I guess you don't have to be a citizen of Michigan to call and complain, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it seems fair.
Okay, so these guys were reaching out going, hey, here's my problem. I think there was one about fixing the roads, right?
Yes,
So any number of these things were coming up that they were saying, hey, this is a problem. What are you doing about it?
that's correct.
Challenging her, and I'm not trying to put words in their mouth and I'm not trying to characterize, but, trying to force the governor, hey, do your job, right? As we see your job needs to be done. Is that correct?
Yes,
And when these things were not getting resolved, then there was some talk somewhere along the line of, getting warrants and going to see a judge and going to find a sheriff that will serve this, right? You recall all of this?
I do.
Fair and accurate, would you say? That's what they were trying to get done at that time?
Well, they certainly discussed it, but they were trying to do a lot of things at the time. So I don't think that was the sole focus.
Okay, fair enough.
Talked about how they couldn't use the legal route, and if they arrested the governor, it'd be considered kidnapping.
Okay. And then they didn't do it, did they?
These guys did not kidnap the governor.
Okay, so again, they were able to look at the situation and someone say, hey, if we kidnap the governor, if we go with this war, we're going to be in trouble. And they went, all right, we're just not doing that. Fair enough?
I didn't hear him say we're not doing that. I mean,
Did they do it?
they did not
Okay.
kidnap the governor.
Okay. I was gonna let this go, but again, because we've got three different defendants, I've got to touch on this, right? You read the police report from 2019 from, I believe, a Trooper Tasker. Is that correct?
I read it a couple of years ago. I don't recall who the trooper is.
Okay, fair enough. But you read, correct me if I'm wrong, a report from a Michigan State police officer dealing with the arrest of Mr. Morrison. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if you recall, was there anything in there that indicated Mr. Morrison resisted?
Nothing that I can recall about.
Nothing that you can recall, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree that when someone resists law enforcement, they're likely committing a crime?
It's very subjective. I mean, it certainly puts them much closer to committing a crime based on their intent and what actions they take.
Okay. And an officer, a trained officer, someone from Michigan State Police would surely, if that had happened, put that in their report,
Oh,
correct?
certainly, yes.
And there probably would have been some subsequent charge to go along with the other charge, correct?
There could be, but I'm
Okay.
sure it would be notated by Michigan State Police if anything like that happened.
And you don't recall anything along those lines?
That's correct.
I believe you testified that it was your understanding he got taken in, gets released, enters a plea. Is that correct?
Generally speaking, yes.
Okay. And I think you said, I think the words you used were that Mr. Morrison got a very favorable plea. Is that correct?
Yes.
How does that happen? Do you know?
Yes, he's had to use some of his own money to get a retained attorney and really fight the charges. He had to,
So did he go to trial and fight these charges?
I know, he got a plea deal.
He got a plea deal. Do you know if this attorney did anything to obtain that plea deal?
I don't know any specifics about what the attorney did, but based on my knowledge of how courts work, the attorney must have done something to obtain the plea deal.
Would it be surprising to you if this was the initial offer when the attorney showed up for the probable cause conference and they said, here's your offer, and Joe said, fine, I mean, this is the deal, and took it?
I don't really know anything about the court negotiations or the attorneys or, all I can tell you is from my perspective, pleading down a felony to a misdemeanor is favorable. And whatever happened, I wasn't there. I can't
Fair
speak to
enough.
it.
And I think we had heard testimony, or maybe you said that he got credit for his one night in jail and paid a small fine. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Anything else that you know of that he got for this?
There might have been a probationary period, which is typical. I don't know what it was in this case, but that usually happens.
But you don't know if he was put on probation. Is that correct?
I can check the certified conviction here
Okay,
if you'd like me to.
I would love that.
I'm looking at exhibit number 11, and I don't see anything about a probation. So I just see the 1 day in jail, 1 credit, and there's a fine.
Okay. Not even worthy of being put on probation. Okay. All right. I believe you referenced Operation Gridlock. Is that correct?
Yes.
What was that?
That was a protest that went viral on Facebook. I think it was in many major cities throughout the US. And I believe in this case, it occurred on April 15th, 2020.
Okay. In the midst of the epidemic, pandemic, whatever,
Absolutely.
people upset by being masked, unmasked, locked down, unlocked down, correct?
Sure.
Across
Yes.
the country.
Yes.
Joe Morrison attend this?
Yes.
Do anything illegal to your knowledge when he attended?
I don't have any specific information about him doing any illegal acts at the protest.
Okay. Exercising his First Amendment right to seek his redress, grievances from his government?
Certainly.
Okay. Is this the protest that Forbes magazine put on in their paper, in their magazine?
I believe that was April 30th.
That was the one on April 30th.
Yes, sir.
Okay. What day was Operation Gridlock? Do you know?
April 15th.
Okay, so I'm off. My apologies. How many people attended the protest on the 30th?
I would guess hundreds.
Hundreds. Okay. Everybody was wearing their masks and stuff to get into the Capitol.
Doubt it.
Okay. But it was required at that time, right?
I don't know about the masks. I recall the temperature check and the questionnaires.
Okay, fair enough. Would you agree that a great number of people were properly wearing their COVID protective mask or some kind of face covering?
Seems fair.
Okay. Because I think one of the things mentioned was that these guys were in there protesting in their face masks. Is that correct?
I don't recall mentioning that, but there was pictures and they had masks on.
Okay. Which was the mandate at that time, correct?
I know, people were certainly being encouraged to wear their masks.
Okay. Would it be safe to say that you don't know the date the governor put that in place? So you can't tell me? Is that
Yes.
fair and accurate?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay. During these trainings that took place here in Jackson, what did Joe teach?
I believe Joe's involvement was very similar to how I described Mr. Musico's involvement. He was hosting the training at his property. As stations were set up, he wasn't the primary instructor for any particular station. He might show up and offer some advice on shooting, or he might set up a berm or ranges or set up a kill house or something to that effect. But he wasn't a lead instructor on any particular thing, like the firearms, the medical, any vehicle ambushes, that sort of thing.
Who was the lead instructor on all these things?
Well, going through them chronologically. So for medical, that was Paul Bellar. For firearms and marksmanship, that was CHS Dan and Ty Garvin.
Okay. So Dan was doing the teaching.
Dan certainly did some teaching.
Okay. correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe I misinterpreted this, and I'm not trying to mischaracterize, but under Mr. Johnson's cross, was one of the things that you told Mr. Roberson that the FBI mission was to disrupt the Wolverine Watchman?
Yes. I don't recall that specific statement, but that was the FBI mission.
To disrupt the Watchman.
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, and we'll just use one specific incident, right? When they're going down to Detroit, you testified you had Dan drive, correct?
Yes.
So that he could diffuse anything that might happen.
Yes.
Wouldn't it have disrupted them just as much by having Dan somehow squelch some of the things that they were doing rather than beef it up?
Yeah, that's what we tried to do multiple occasions.
That's what you tried to do by having Dan teach these guys this stuff?
By having Dan teach, that was a role that he filled in the group, but on multiple occasions, we tried to de-escalate the situation.
Okay. So when Dan vouches for Adam Fox to be incorporated in, how does that diffuse the Watchman?
Well, I've never used the term that Dan vouches for him.
Okay.
I instructed Dan to use his judgment and play a role as a member of the group. And if something was brought up to the group, he should participate as he sees fit. And if there's anybody that's particularly violent or seems to be planning, I wanted him to get information on that person. So as they discussed Adam Fox, I heard Dan say that he was okay with him when they asked. And something to that, basically something about how he was fine if he came.
Okay. Would you agree that if Dan would have said, no, I went to the Vac Shack, he's crazy, we don't want him here, that would have diffused and disrupted the Watchman also?
Well, in these hypotheticals, my concern would be that if Dan didn't go along with what the group wanted, that he'd be ostracized from the group and he'd lose access and we would have no coverage of what was going on.
Didn't this group vote him their leader?
No,
No?
that's correct.
The Wolverine Watchmen, did they take a vote on who their leader should be?
Well, we listened to the discussion, which is the only discussion I'm aware of. Paul Bellar suggested that Dan should be the leader and he said no. And then they discussed as a group and decided Joe Morrison would be the leader.
They didn't take a vote.
Not to my knowledge, but I'm only referring to that particular recording. So if there's
Okay.
a different instance that you're referring to, maybe.
No?
refresh
Did you
my memory.
debrief Dan after this meeting?
Absolutely.
And he didn't tell you there was a vote?
He told me that Paul Bellar had wanted him to be the leader and he said no. And I said, that's great.
Okay. But
Not
did
allowed
he
to be.
tell you there was a vote?
No.
Maybe he forgot. I think you were,
Hold on for a second. Was there ever?
I was never aware of any votes.
continue, Your Honor, or?
Go ahead. You threw it out there and it made me think, was there a vote or wasn't there a vote? So I wanted to clarify that point.
I think the clarity will come, Your Honor.
Okay.
I believe Mr. Johnson asked you about ranks. Do you recall that?
I do.
and Mr. Johnson asked you, he said, look, if we've got a CO and an XO, those are military in context, I believe is the way, that might not be his wording, but that was the message, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I think your response was, well, also in gangs, correct?
Correct.
Does that extend to anything beyond the military and gangs?
I suppose it could be like a ship captain.
Would you say that an Eagles post or an Elks Lodge or a Moose Lodge, they've probably got some kind of rank structure. This is the person in charge. This is the sergeant at arms.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that any particular organization could have a rank structure, and it wouldn't be, you could probably find a number of them.
Okay, so it's not limited, when Mr. Johnson said military and you said, well, and also gangs, it's not limited to those two. Would you agree?
I'm just talking about the terms they used when they described it. So they described it as setting it up like a military or a gang.
Okay.
So that's the only clarification.
And again, I'm not trying to rehash the same ground, but as we established, Mr. Morris and Mr. Musico live at the same property, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it was your testimony that when the search warrants were executed, no cache of weapons was found. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Any explosives
No,
attributable to Mr. Morrison? No.
no,
Any unlawful firearms attributable to Mr. Morrison?
no.
And again, I'm not trying to rehash, but you were asked, I think, on direct when we were going over some of these chats, what was it called? A vibe check,
Yes,
right? And you said that you looked that up. Is that correct?
yes.
Where did you find this definition that you gave us of the vibrating of the vest plate as being a vibe check?
I don't recall specifically, but my go-to was urbandictionary.com. Every time that there was some acronym or slang that I wasn't familiar with.
And that was the definition in Urban Dictionary.
I don't recall in this specific instance what I researched or what I used, but generally that's what I used, and I remember searching for Boogaloo Boys along with it and doing various Google searches.
Okay. And again, I apologize, Your Honor, I'm just making sure we're not doubling over. Agent, what is, and if you don't know this acronym, then I apologize, what is MOUT training?
Mount?
MOUT. MOUT.
I don't know.
You don't know?
No.
Okay. These QRFs. Were they set up to be like, and correct me if I'm wrong, QRF? Quick Response Force, is that what it stands for?
Yeah, quick response, quick reaction.
And did they have like a mission statement or something that they were focused on and supposed to do?
Well, Joe Morrison had a mission statement for the group, which included QRFs on Facebook. And then once Paul Bellar established the Ghost Group, he had a different mission statement for that QRF.
Okay, and I appreciate that. I'm not trying to get into the ghost group, right? That's Mr. Bellar. That's a whole nother case. So we're gonna narrow this down.
So,
Was it designed to respond to, well, how were they supposed to respond? How were they supposed to know to respond?
based on direction from the leadership or the administrators of the group.
Was there some kind of system where, you know, if a watchman got in trouble, they pinged their, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
How did that work?
So there's a ping feature on Wire, which is intended to get everybody's attention. And then there's a location drop or a pin drop, which will provide your GPS coordinates. So if you did a ping and a location drop, that was a message for the team to respond to you.
Okay. Was Mr. Morrison involved in a traffic stop other than the one that you know of in the one with the trooper we spoke of earlier?
During the course of the case,
Yeah.
I know one time he was stopped by Westland PD.
Okay. And that's in Wayne County? Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
And if you don't, I understand.
I'm not sure exactly, but I believe.
Is it in Jackson County that you know of?
It is not in Jackson County.
Okay. So the fact that Mr. Morrison was out of Jackson County, not really relevant, is it,
Relevant to what?
to this investigation?
Oh, it's definitely relevant.
It's relevant that he was outside of Jackson County during the investigation?
Sure.
How?
Well, one of the key components of any terrorism investigation is you need to know where the subjects are at all times.
But he didn't know he was the subject of anything, did he?
Based on his statements, he knew he was the subject of an investigation.
Okay. But the fact that he left Jackson County and went, and we're going to assume it's in Wayne. I believe it's in Wayne,
Yeah, I agree.
but we heard earlier that there was this issue that these guys from Jackson went all the way to Detroit for this protest. Do you know why Mr. Morrison was in Wayne County that day?
My guess is he was working, but I don't know.
Working like a regular job, like actual working?
I think so. I knew he had a regular job.
I see the relevance. Okay. So he goes out of county, gets stopped by an officer from Westland PD.
Yes,
Does he send out one of these pings that, hey, I'm in trouble, the cops got me?
no,
So he doesn't alert the QRF to come to his rescue, does he?
that's correct.
Did he get stopped at any time that you know of here in Jackson County?
Not that I know of.
Not that you know of. Okay, fair enough. I think we heard testimony that Dan got paid about $54,000 for his involvement. Is that correct?
Yes,
Give or take. I'm not holding you to the penny, but somewhere in that. And this was all to reimburse him. Is that correct?
no, not all to reimburse him. I mean, some things we requested specific receipts to reimburse him for,
Like what?
like a watch, a phone, a computer, gas receipts. And other things, we just gave a general lump sum payment. And then it was up to him to, for instance, pay a hotel bill, or it was supposed to cover gas, but it wasn't a dollar for dollar reimbursement of the gas or any ammo. That was just to provide something for him to cover on his own.
Okay. When did you extract Dan from this operation? I think that was the term you used, and if I'm misquoting it, but I think you told Mr. Johnson that in very early September, the decision was made to extract Dan for his safety. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we extracted Dan, not from the operation, but we moved him away from Mr. Musico and Mr. Morrison at that period in time. So he was taken off at some time from the Wolverine Watchman chats, and he was basically no longer a member of the Watchmen.
What day was that? Do you know?
It was we tasked him, it was towards the end of August and then into September. We were trying to figure out what was going on between Pete Musico calling Dan and telling him there was going to be an intel dump, and there was going to be names of feds put out there, until finally when Mr. Musico reached out to Adam Fox. So there was a period of figuring things out from the end of August till the beginning of September, when we decided he was no longer safe to go to Munich.
So somewhere, would it be safe to say in that first week of September?
Yes.
Then what was the need to reimburse him on September 17th, $3,300 for this computer so he could continue to participate?
Well, by this period in time, he was an operator with Adam Fox, and the plot against the governor was continuing.
But these guys were out of it. Is that correct?
They weren't operators. They
Okay,
continued
fair
to
enough.
communicate with Adam Fox.
Is communication between people illegal?
It can be.
So if they're just saying whatever, they don't have a free speech, First Amendment right to have a conversation?
Well, the right to free speech exists, and then conspiracy,
These,
To a
are
number
these
of-
gentlemen charged with conspiracy?
absolutely not.
Thank you. So how does it come to be then, subtracting this $3,300 for a computer, that we just give up, we being the American taxpayer, give up $54,000? Is there a requisite program? Do you requisition this money? How does that work?
Yes, so through Delta, which is our source program, we have to write a request, which goes through my supervisor and through his supervisor, and we have to say why we think that money is needed and what it's going to be going for, and it's under that particular source. So that was submitted in this case for the instances each time CHS Dan was paid.
And he was paid in cash?
Yes, sir.
Are there records to these payments?
Yes, there's a receipt, which is signed and then uploaded, and then I have to upload the ATM document in which I pull the money out. There's a lot of paperwork required to validate that.
Does Dan have to sign for it?
Yes.
Ballard, we're gonna take a break.
Very good, Your Honor.
3 o'clock, a little after
Yeah,
3.
yeah.
Judge, who needs to collect the exhibits from the jury?
Oh, go ahead,
You want to just have, you want me to do it or do you want to do it?
go ahead.
Can you just pass the exhibits to one person and leave them at the,
Thank you.
sorry about that, Jan.
Not a big deal.
What's the worst thing?
Corey, are
My video.
off video? Hey, about 15 minutes.
All rise for the jury.
All rise for the jury.
Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, it was brought to my attention that some of the exhibits were handed out, Exhibit W, that some of you made notes on them. Nobody looked at those notes. I had them all collected up. They were actually just sitting in a pile. Nobody had gone through them, but I've taken custody of them. I'm not even gonna look at whatever notes may be there. And what's gonna happen is when it concludes, if you want Exhibit W or you want all the exhibits, I'll have a copy of the original made. The rest are gonna be shredded later today. Just so you're aware. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Agent, welcome back. Thank you. I want to go back to something I think was put out on direct. And I believe Mr. Johnson touched on this, but again, as we've said, right, multiple defendants, multiple reasons to act. Do you know what the vetting that Dan had to go through, CHS Dan, had to go through to get involved with the Watchman?
No, all I know is that it wasn't as developed as it became later in April and May.
Do you know what the questions were that they were posed?
No,
Did you testify that he was or was not asked if he wanted to be or would consider himself a domestic terrorist?
I testified that he wasn't asked that question.
He wasn't.
Correct.
And then I believe Mr. Johnson followed up on that. Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay. We talked about these 1023s, right?
Yes,
And
sir.
you told me this is, and I'm just paraphrasing, right? If my words are wrong, please correct me, but this is similar to a police report, right? That you're an FBI agent, correct?
Yes.
Write reports, correct? Law enforcement related reports.
Yes, this is what we call a source report.
A 1023 is a source report.
Yes.
Other reports for other things, is that correct?
Yes.
And you are, again, correct me if I'm mischaracterizing, I'm not trying to. You are the agent in charge of what we're doing here in this trial. Is that correct?
So I'm the TEI, so the Terrorism Enterprise Investigation Case Agent, and I'm the handling agent for Dan. For each individual subject, there's an individual FBI agent assigned to that particular subject as a threat.
Okay. May I approach you on?
Go ahead.
Take a look. Sorry.
I'm approaching Special Agent. Can you tell me what this is?
This is the source report from the first date of contact. It was authored by Special Agent Chambers.
Special Agent Chambers wrote this. Okay. And what is his involvement in this case?
So he was what we call a co-case. So Jason and I were co-cases. So we were both agents assigned to the Terrorism Enterprise Investigation. We were both handling agents for CHS Dan.
Okay. And this source report would be, and I'm not trying to characterize, so tell me if I'm wrong, right? But this would be the law enforcement report from the initial conversation with Dan. Is that correct?
Yes,
Are the vetting questions that he was asked listed on there?
yes.
And what are those questions?
Are you okay being called a domestic terrorist? Are you okay with drug use?
Agent, I thought he wasn't asked about being a domestic terrorist at this point.
So these are the vetting questions when we met with him. They're not the vetting questions when he got into the group.
I don't understand. Can you explain that more clearly for me? This is the report, correct me if I'm wrong, on the initial meeting with Dan. Is that correct?
So yeah, so on March 17th, Agent Chambers and I met with Dan and we
Uh-huh.
debriefed him. And vetting questions about the vetting process were asked. And Dan reported that they were asking, are you okay being called a domestic terrorist and are you okay with drug use?
And he was.
Based on my recollection, and you can ask Dan when he testifies, but my recollection was that when Dan got into the group, which was weeks before that, he himself wasn't asked that question.
But what does this report say?
This report is what Dan reported Agent Chambers and I when we first met him.
Approach Ron.
Go ahead.
So just so that I'm clear on what I'm hearing. Sure. Just so that I'm clear on what I'm hearing. The testimony under direct and then under Mr. Johnson's cross was that he was not asked if he wanted to be a domestic terrorist. Is that correct?
That's my recollection.
That is your recollection. Would it be safe for me to say then that obviously Agent Chambers has a totally different recollection?
No, that would not be safe to say.
This says that this is what he was asked, does it not?
No, it does not say that.
What does it say?
It says that when we met with Dan,
Uh-huh.
Dan reported that during the vetting process, members were being asked that.
When did that start?
When did what start?
That they started asking this question about domestic terrorists?
We didn't ask him at the time, and it doesn't say in the report, nor do I recall that.
Okay. This report, correct me if I'm wrong, notes the meeting that took place on the 17th. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in this, does it or does it not say that one of the vetting questions is, are you okay with being called a domestic terrorist?
It does say that.
It does. Okay. All right. Let's back up. Because this is interesting to me. Agent, can you tell me what a quality service increase is? If you know,
Quality,
service increase.
I don't know what that is.
No, okay, fair enough, and that's fine. I just was wondering if you had an answer for that. The meme that we saw with the tombstones and the commentary, I believe, and I'm not trying to quote it, but I believe it said, "Look, son, good cops," or something along those lines, right?
Yes, I recall it.
Who do you attribute the posting of that to?
I'd have to check the exhibit.
Please.
I have to find, okay, I think we're talking exhibit 19.
Let me look. I don't.
Oh,
Would be,
yes, it is exhibit 19 and that's Ty Garbin.
okay. So this was one of the things, correct me if I'm wrong, that you attributed to being the threat to law enforcement. Is that correct?
No, this just told me about what the group's intentions were. What
How-
I perceived to be their
Okay.
intentions. I understand I'm not in their heads.
Okay. So how do you derive that as being their intention? How do you get from that meme to these guys' intention, these guys being the Wolverine Watchmen, desire to kill cops?
Well, based on what Dan told me, using the Onyx hunting app and the plan to have reverse red flag warrants on law enforcement officers' homes, I viewed this as corroborating information which showed they had a hatred of cops. So I don't view this in and of itself as a singular threat or anything that's illegal. In context, the statements that Dan said he thought were concerning and he thought were indicative of their ideology, I thought that was representative of what Dan described to me. And then when I looked at his phone, it seemed accurate to what Dan talked about.
When you looked at his phone, did it have this, what is it called? Onyx hunting app?
Well, Dan didn't download the Onyx hunting app. That's what Mr. Musico had reported that they were supposed to download.
Did you find this app anywhere?
I don't know if it was on his phone. Mr. Musico's phone at the end of the case. That wasn't something that one of the agents who reviewed the phone had reported to me.
I don't understand. One of the agents reported you that they did see it or they did not see it?
They didn't tell me anything about it. I
Okay,
don't know.
all right, fair enough. Have you looked into this app?
I downloaded it myself and I tried to use it when I was hunting. It seemed like a good hunting app.
And again, I think I started off by saying, right, and I'll just put it out there if I did, I'm a computer idiot. I take my phone, when I'm forced to get a new one, I give it to my son, I tell him erase everything that's not absolutely necessary. So what is this Onyx hunting app? I truly don't know.
Yeah, so it's kind of a combination of like satellite imagery and public property records. So it looks through a lot of like the Register of Deeds information at who owns property. Then it maps out those plots and parcels on a satellite image. It's a paid subscription service, so I got kicked out because I wasn't going to pay for it. But what it'll do is you can do a search via name, and it would tell you the property and the parcel of the public landowner who owns that.
Okay, and then I can know if I can hunt on it or not. Is that its purpose,
Yes,
basically?
yes.
But you have no recollection that any of these defendants, specifically Joe Morrison, had this in his phone?
I don't know if they had that in their phone or not.
Okay. And I would have to have the name of a specific police officer, would I not?
That's correct.
So if I tried to look up, if I took this hunting app and I type in John Smith, it's gonna give me what, every piece of property owned by someone named John Smith in the state?
It's got some search filters, so I think you can filter via area. But generally speaking, yeah, I think it would provide the John Smiths who own parcels in that area. I didn't pay for the extra services, and I think
Okay.
it's one of those things where it gives you the better app if you pay.
Okay, so it's doing nothing, correct me if I'm wrong, but scanning the publicly available records for information.
Correct.
So if I wanted to find out where law enforcement officer John Smith owned property and was that motivated to do so, I could contact the Jackson County Register Clerk of Court and the Wayne County Clerk of Court, and right?
Yes.
So by downloading this app, if in fact it was downloaded and used, is it illegal? Okay, so now we've covered that we've got a meme with some tombstones on it and a reference to a perfectly legal application on a phone. What else drew your attention to open or to spark your interest in Mr. Morrison and the Wolverine Watch?
Well, the references to shooting law enforcement, to explosives and machine guns.
And the machine gun, correct me if I'm wrong, that reference you said was a schematic, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Was there any photographs of machine guns?
Mr. Ty Garvin had uploaded a number of schematics, and I don't know if they actually had photographs of pieces and components, or if they were just the diagrams. So I can't recall, but they were all basically how to. That's that type of thing.
Where were these schematic, were these hand drawn, like Ty Garvin drew these up on a piece of paper and said, here, let me slap this on here?
Well,
Or was it something copyrighted and available to the world?
they appeared to be hand drawn and customized, but I don't know if Ty Garvin did it. These are exhibits that we entered.
Right, but you've testified about these exhibits, correct?
Yes.
Okay,
So on this exhibit, which is a schematic from exhibit 19, it appears to be a screen capture from a website of a hand-drawn auto sear construction.
okay. So what website, do you know?
I don't know. There's a, oh, I can't tell in the bottom corner where if that's from this page or not.
Okay, so again, just so I'm clear, these schematics in and of themselves are not illegal, correct?
That's correct.
So by possessing them, and let's put it out there, right? There are some things that mere possession, even without intent, is unlawful, correct?
That's correct.
You would say child pornography. There's no reason, there's nothing lawful about that, correct?
Correct.
It's not protected, correct? But these are captured from some website, to your understanding?
Yes, I think that's fair.
And would it be fair to say that if I had this in my possession and you came to my house, it's lawful for me to have that schematic, wouldn't it be?
Yes.
Does the schematic say to anybody, take your, what kind of firearm is that for? First off, let me ask you that.
It's for an SKS rifle.
An SKS rifle. And what is that fire, if you know?
Well, SKS is Russian made, so I'd assume like a AK-47 style.
So, and I'm not gonna hold you to the caliber, but like a 223, something along those
Yeah.
lines?
Yes, sir.
Okay. anywhere on that schematic, does it tell you to take your firearm and do this? Or is it more an instruction manual on how to do it?
It's more an instruction manual. There's actually a list of, looks like 15 things, and they're too small to be able to read from the photograph.
Okay, and this is something you saw on Dan's phone?
Yes,
So this photograph is
I got another-
from Dan's phone?
yes, sir.
And what size page is that you have in front of you, if you know?
This is an 8.5 by 11.
And would it be safe for me to assume that Dan's phone was not 8.5 by 11?
That's correct.
So if it's too small for you to read on an 8.5 by 11, how could you read it on a phone?
Well, phones have an ability to zoom in and zoom out on photographs, so it's,
To beyond that size?
we can zoom pretty far in. I'm not suggesting that this font right here that I could read, nor did I try
Okay.
when I met with Dan.
Okay, fair enough. But we've covered that. So far, we've got a meme, distasteful as some of us may find it to be, and I don't find it tasteful, right? But we've got a meme with some tombstones on it. We've got an First Amendment protected cookbook. And we've got some instructions on how to modify a Russian firearm to automatic. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
No photographs of actual machine guns, right?
Judge, can we approach from that?
Yes.
So getting back to where we were, right? We've got the meme, we've got the cookbook, we've got this document right here. Anything else that you can point to for me that tells me why you felt there was a threat to law enforcement?
Well, the explosives and then the report from Dan of the QRF response to.
Okay, explosives. Are there photographs of explosives?
There's not photographs of explosives.
So then what explosives are you referring to?
I'm talking about the description of explosives that are the statements in the chat, and then the household substitutes that can be used for explosives.
The household substitutes from the First Amendment protected cookbook, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Where can I get this cookbook? Amazon?
I'm sure you could get it there.
Okay. So I'm still just stuck on what fired up this investigation. Where did we come up with from these things that we were opening this investigation due to violence against police officers? What about this schematic is violent towards police officers?
Well, the investigation wasn't opened based
Judge.
on this information.
I'm gonna object. I think this has been asked and answered a few times now.
Ballard, is there something different you're hoping to get?
I'm hoping to get the tie-in between testimony where we opened this investigation because of threats of violence against police officers and these schematics and these pictures. And I'm just not hearing it. And I apologize that I've asked this.
It's not just the one thing. You're focusing on this. There's something more you want to get out of this.
No, Your Honor,
It's a
I'm-
combination of multiple things that caused.
Right, but it's a multitude of things that even collectively jammed together. Again, a schematic of a firearm is not a threat to police officers. It could be, if he would have said, well, we have this threat of mass destruction, we have this weapon of assault,
The
but that's not
schematic is
it.
to make it an illegal weapon,
I'm sorry?
not the schematic to make it an illegal weapon.
Yes, and maybe this will help out. I didn't open the investigation until after Dan was tasked to go to training and then came back with specific threats of violence and more specifics from the March 22nd FTX meeting. That's what we used to open the investigation.
So again, I will then draw your attention to testimony you gave in a preliminary examination in the 86th District Court for the County of Antrim, people of the state of Michigan, versus a number of defendants. And you were specifically asked, on what day did you,
I'm sorry, what page are you?
I am
talking
on
about?
page 24
Of what?
of this is the preliminary exam transcript, day 1 of 4 before the Honorable Michael Stepka, District Court, Traverse City, Michigan, Monday, August 29th.
Okay.
And I am on,
Page 24. Okay, thank you.
So, but I'll even go back one further. I'll go start on page 16. Why did you open an investigation, you were asked? And your answer was, we opened this investigation regarding threats to law enforcement. And I have it here if you would like to refresh your memory. But that was your testimony. We opened this investigation regarding the threats against law enforcement. There were also allegations of illegal weapons. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, and those are correct statements.
They are. So then on page 24, it starts off, okay, you met him. Yes, tell us when. March 17th, 2020. And where did you meet him? Interviewed him and received his phone. There's some distance in there. There's an objection. Moving on to line 14. What did you see when you looked in his phone? Answer. So I saw numerous communications on an encrypted application involving violence against police officers and illegal weapons. So at this point, what are the illegal weapons that you saw?
I'm referring to the schematics of the machine guns and the explosives.
Okay, that's not what this says. This says violence against police officers and illegal weapons. What illegal weapon did you see?
What I'm referring to is the schematic. When I say, I'm not referring to a specific machine gun that I saw. I'm referring to the schematic of the machine gun.
Did you clarify that in the exam?
I don't think I did clarify. I think it was needed to be clarified.
You think that the schematic of how to alter a weapon and an actual weapon are the same?
No, sir.
Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Patrick?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, everyone. It's been a while. Good afternoon, Agent Impola. How are you?
I'm good. Good afternoon, Counselor.
So, couple things I want to go through with you, Agent Impola. You agree with me that right now, and I'm only gonna be talking about Mr. Beller for the most part, because you understand that that's my concern in this case, correct?
I understand.
And so you are aware that Mr. Beller is not charged with making a terrorist threat, correct?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
The charges in this case are materially supporting a terrorist act. You would agree with that, correct?
I'd agree.
And you talked about the Boogaloo movement, correct? We talked about it ad nauseam. You've been here for quite some time, right?
Yes.
And you define the Boogaloo movement. Would you agree with me that individuals that follow the Boogaloo movement, adherents say they are preparing for or seek to incite a second civil war? You agree with that, correct?
Yes, that seems fair.
So not everyone in the Boogaloo movement's position or end result, if you will, is to incite a Second Amendment, correct? Is that fair?
Just to incite a Second Amendment.
A second civil war.
Um,
Let me rephrase it for you because I know it kind of threw off there. Not everyone in the Boogaloo movement joins it to incite a second civil war, correct?
I think that's fair.
Some people get into the Boogaloo movement because they are preparing for a potential civil war, correct? Is that fair?
At the end of the day, I think the Civil War is the end goal. I think like your standard prepper, so to speak, wouldn't be in the Boogaloo movement.
Okay.
So, for the spectrum of people getting into the Boogaloo movement, there's certainly a spectrum of reasons why they get in and how they view the movement. And I view your standard prepper is not in the Boogaloo movement. And then amongst that spectrum, the final goal is a civil war, whether it's incited or whether it just happens.
So you got a prepper and then you got a doer, right?
Yes,
Preppers preparing, doers actually doing something to make it happen. Does that sound fair?
yeah, I mean, the doer is, so in the Boogaloo movement is an ideology related to the Civil War and fighting the government. So being a Boogaloo member itself doesn't necessarily mean you're a doer either. Boogaloo movement is that violent ideology.
But I guess we're playing semantics. The Boogaloo could also be preparing for a civil war, correct?
I think that'd be included in
Thank you.
that, yes.
Thank you. So I'm gonna draw your, one thing I do have to clear up. You testified, I don't know what day it was. Can you go to exhibit number 16, please?
Yes, I have it here.
And that is, I believe you, could we bring that up? Sure, please. Actually, we can just. You testified that that was an alias of Mr. Beller?
Well, it's his Facebook profile name, Paul Zacharias, and then oftentimes they refer to each other by their handles in person.
Right, I believe your testimony was that Paul Zacharias was an alias for Paul Beller, correct?
Yes.
We insinuating that he was trying to use a name other than his own?
All I'm saying is that Paul Zacharias on Facebook is Paul Bellar in real life.
But you also insinuated that it was an alias, correct?
Yeah, yes, it is an alias.
And were you aware through your investigation that this was actually his grandfather's name that was adopted? You made
No, I
that?
didn't know that.
I'm gonna get right to the chase. We've talked ad nauseum about protests, threats, all these statements made by Mr. Beller, correct?
Yes, sir.
When Mr. Beller attended every protest and every QRF, he never violated any laws. He was never, let me strike that, he was never charged with any crimes, correct?
Correct. He was never charged with crimes.
And in fact, when he left the state of Michigan on July 27th, on or about, when he left the state of Michigan on July 27th, he was not charged with any crimes and was not arrested for any crimes, correct?
That's correct.
Did you want something put up there?
I don't need it anymore. I should have asked you
Turned off.
earlier because it needed to warm up, so it
Okay.
wasn't that. I am gonna need some other things. I would appreciate it if it could stay up. Also, when he went to the Capitol on June 18th, or any Capitol protest, including the QRFs, he never committed any act of violence, correct?
That's correct.
Also, up until the time that Mr. Beller left the state of Michigan, he never committed an act of violence against any member of Michigan, correct?
That's correct.
And also, he never assaulted any officer or pointed a firearm at any officer when he left the state of Michigan on July 27th. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you put up Exhibit 74, please? I want to talk about real quick the QRF on May 30th of 20. That was the one in Detroit, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that was the one where you were talking about, I think the heading, we'll see it here in a second, is Paul ready to go lethal or something along those lines?
Yes, sir.
In fact, the title of that exhibit that you presented to the jury is Beller, I'm going lethal, right?
Correct.
In fact, what Mr. Beller says is, no, if they start going lethal, I'm going lethal. Is that correct? Is that fair?
Yes, so the transcript is under transcript. So the description up there, that's something that we created as a prosecution team to remind ourselves which clip this is. So it's not, his exact words are under the underlined transcript portion.
Fair enough. Okay, that's fair. Under transcript is what he actually said, correct?
Correct.
What's actually recorded, correct?
Yes,
And he says, no, if they start going lethal, I'm going lethal, correct?
that's correct.
And someone, I guess we don't, an unidentified male says, yeah. And then Mr. Bell says, I'm frustrated. I'm sorry. If I see a cop start shooting civilians, I'm shooting that cop. That's what he says, right?
Yes, sir.
He doesn't say anywhere in this conversation that he wants to go offensive on a police officer, correct?
I consider that to be offensive.
You consider him saying, if I need to protect a citizen, a civilian, that I'm going to go lethal to be offensive?
Yes, sir.
Well, that presupposes it's a if then, correct?
All I know is if you're killing people and you're intending to kill people, it seems offensive to me.
So do you believe that there is a law in Michigan, a self-defense law, correct?
I'm generally aware of
I'm
self.
not going to ask you to cite it. I'm certainly not going to ask you to know it. I know you're a federal officer, but you agree that there are self-defense laws in the state of Michigan, right?
Yes, sir.
And those self-defense laws allow you to use deadly force in the defense of yourself or others, correct?
I don't know. It seems pretty nuanced here. I generally.
Sir, I'm not asking you about this.
Oh,
I'm asking you a general question. Okay? In the state of Michigan, this is a general question. If you are saving your life or the life of another, you are allowed to use deadly force, correct?
I don't know the law good enough to testify about it. I think that seems like a fair sentiment. It seems like something that's logical. I just don't know the law.
You would also agree with me that law enforcement officers are not above the law, correct?
Absolutely.
Would you please bring that There's some further conversation at this QRF on May 30th about what if the cops roll up on it. Should we call that? You should have it there in front of you. It's if you didn't hear me, it's Exhibit 78.
Yes, I have it here.
And what we're talking about here is if the cops roll up on you, and Mr. Beller says at the bottom there, if a cop rolls up, I'll just disassemble it. Quote, I can't shoot it when the bolt's out. Quote, I already have one in the chamber. And then he says, no turning back, correct?
Correct.
But if he takes the bolt out of the rifle, it's not going to fire, correct? No bolt in the rifle means no firing pin, correct?
Correct.
So we've established that up until Mr. Beller leaves the state of Michigan on or about July 27th, between 27th and 29th, he has not been charged with any crimes in the state of Michigan, correct?
Correct.
He has not committed any acts of violence in the state of Michigan, correct?
Correct.
He has not leveled his firearm on any police officer, correct?
Correct.
He has not assaulted a police officer in any way, correct?
Correct.
And he's broken no laws at any protest and or QRF that he's attended as it pertains to this case, correct?
Well, breaking a law involves his intentions and his actions, and it's very difficult for me to say his intentions when he responds to a lot of these things. So he wasn't-
Exactly. You're speculating, right?
That's correct.
So you would have to speculate on what Mr. Beller's intentions are to determine whether or not a crime was committed, correct?
That's correct.
And he got in his car and he left Michigan on July 27th, and he never returned to the state of Michigan, to your knowledge, correct?
Correct.
And he never engaged in any further training in the state of Michigan, to your knowledge, correct?
Correct.
Well, can we put the timeline up? The jury will be happy. Let's move all the way to event number 11. Let's start on event number 11. Event number 11 is the training in Munich on June 14th of 2020, correct?
Yes, sir.
Paul Beller's present for that, right?
Yes, sir.
And I think you testified a minute ago that Dan was the main tactical firearms instructor and Paul was the main medic. Is that a fair statement?
Dan and Ty Garvin both did the firearms training but yes, Paul Bellar was the medic.
Okay. Cindy, could you please bring up exhibit 108?
I'm not the one bringing it
Oh,
up.
I'm
It's
sorry.
Agent Harris.
I'm
So you
sorry.
can ask him.
Why?
No, it's okay. No, you're fine. Just if you can ask him.
Thank you. Before this training on June 14th, you presented to the jury this training schedule that Mr. Bellar created. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And when we're talking about tactics and ambushes, if you could go to the second paragraph down, last paragraph, could you read that for the jury one more time?
The full paragraph or just the
No,
last line?
just the last, that right there, the very last one.
I don't know jack shit about ambushes, so this is all Beaker and Dan's shit. I'm out. LMAO.
So that's clear that he doesn't know the ambush training, but he knows the medical training. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
Okay. They do a training. Adam Fox isn't there, right?
That's correct.
In fact, up to this date, Mr. Beller had never met Adam Fox, correct?
Correct.
Had never communicated directly with Adam Fox, correct?
Correct.
Had never met Barry Croft, correct?
Correct.
Had never communicated directly with Barry Croft, correct?
Correct.
So we do this training. The training's done. Paul leaves early, right?
Yes.
Paul leaves, and then there's a phone call to Adam Fox, correct?
Yes.
Paul's not there for that phone call, right?
Correct.
And then you testified earlier that later on that night, Dan with you, you're here. Dan and you go back to the office in Flint and you actually reach out to, Dan does through you to Adam Fox, correct?
Yes, sir.
And there's quite a long conversation there between Dan and Adam Fox, right?
At least 20 minutes, maybe 25, 30 minutes.
25, 30 minutes. Dan's kind of excited with him, right? You agree with that?
Well, Adam Fox is certainly excited. I think
Absolutely.
Dan all along in the conversation.
Right, follow along. They're both rah. Adam's getting up, Dan's getting up, right? They're getting excited.
I mean, it's not,
I'm exaggerating.
Yeah.
They were getting a little pumped up though. That's not fair.
it was Adam and Amanda Keller on the call.
Okay.
So there was,
Your informant heard Adam getting all pumped up, right?
yes, sir.
And your informant hearing that, he talks about training in Munich, correct?
He makes a statement about training.
Right. He's talking to Adam Fox about coming to Munich to train, correct?
Yes,
Paul's not a part of that conversation either, right?
that's correct.
In fact, when he's on the phone with him, he's talking about what great training they do in Munich. Is that fair?
Yes,
And Dan is talking about how he teaches the tactical stuff down there. Is that fair?
Yes,
So Adam Fox then comes to training, I'm sorry, the next event is June 18th, the Capitol. That's the first time that Mr. Beller ever met Adam Fox, correct?
yes.
And this is the Capitol we've talked about ad nauseum, so I'm gonna get pretty quick through this pretty quickly. But this is the first time that Mr. Beller's actually spoken to Adam Fox, right?
Yes, sir.
And you would agree with me that his conversations with Adam Fox that day were minimal, correct?
I had a hard time monitoring because of all the crowd noise.
Gotcha.
So I couldn't hear the specifics of a lot of the conversations.
But again, Mr. Beller goes to the Capitol, June 18th. They go inside the Capitol, right?
Not on that day.
They didn't go in on June 18th.
No.
Sure about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I was just listening. So, and as I said, I couldn't hear what was going on. But I believe there was singing outside, like on the rotunda, and there was a band and everybody was around the steps. So if somebody went in, I wasn't aware of it.
Okay, fair enough. But again, there was no laws broken on June 18th, correct?
Not to my knowledge.
It wasn't Paul that brought Adam Fox into this group. Isn't that a fair statement?
That's correct.
Please bring up, well, strike that. So they leave the Capitol on June 18th. They all go their separate ways, correct?
I don't know any specifics of how they left, but yes, they left and general statement sounds fair.
Paul didn't leave with Adam, right?
Correct.
They didn't ride together there or ride home together, correct?
That's correct. Not with Adam.
Right. There's some discussion about the shop back, meeting at the shop back on August 20th, correct?
Back shack.
Back shop. What did I say?
Shop
back.
back.
Oh, it's getting late. What was up late last night? They go to the back shop on June 20th, correct?
Yes.
Now, my client is, Mr. Beller is not a part of speaking to Adam Fox directly, right? About this meeting at the back shop, correct?
As far as setting it up or when he gets there?
No, setting it up.
Correct.
Yeah, he talks to him when he gets there. We'll get
Yeah, yeah.
So, but he doesn't, he's not communicating directly with Adam Fox about, hey, we got this meeting at the vac shop. I'm gonna come to the vac shop. He doesn't communicate with Adam. He communicates through Pete or Joe, right?
Yeah, Joe Morrison is pushing out all the information from Adam Fox.
The prosecutor asked you about, well, Paul drove himself over there because Paul lived in Milford, right?
Yes,
Paul didn't live in Jackson County yet.
that's correct.
And the prosecutor made an issue about, well, Paul drove himself and then Dan and Ty Garvin rode together in a separate vehicle. Do you recall that?
Yes,
And do you recall the informant, Dan, ever telling you that Paul had to leave a little early because he had a date on that side of the state?
I know he had a date. I know I got this issue mixed up as far as him leaving early. I had thought he was
We'll get there.
supposed to leave early,
Right?
but then I heard them talking in the parking lot afterwards.
And you agree with me, he had a date, right?
Yes,
And you would agree that it would be kind of cramp your style if you roll to your date with informant Dan, Ty Garvin sitting in the back while you're picking up your date. You'd agree with that, right?
well, I think logistically, Paul was spending the night with his date, so
Okay.
logistically, they had to have separate vehicles.
Well, would you go on a date with a woman? I strike that. I should not even said any of that. I take that all back. Would you have gone on a date and brought two guys
No,
with you?
I don't think they would want to
All right,
go on a date
fair enough.
with Paul.
So now we are at the shop back on June 20th. And the meeting goes into the basement. Could you pull up 125, please?
Battery 100%.
Remember this exhibit, Agent Impola?
Yes, sir.
This is the exhibit that was put up, it was Friday afternoon. This is the exhibit when I was asking you some questions about what you believed, Mr. Beller, and I'm talking about the 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth paragraph down by Mr. Beller, it's right there in the middle of the page. And I asked you on the record what you believed Mr. Beller was saying when he talked about if Michigan is going to go and we're going to be taking our governor, I want to see more states do the same thing. You remember me talking to you about that?
Yes, sir.
And your response to me was, well, I don't know what he means. I can only read his words, correct?
Yes.
And then I asked you, isn't it true that before this conversation, there was talk in the shop back about actually getting an arrest warrant for the governor? Is that correct?
Yes.
And you said you want to make sure I phrase this correctly. If I don't, I'm sure you'll correct me. You recall some conversation about a citizen's arrest or an arrest warrant, but you're not sure if it happened before this was said or after this was said. Is that fair?
Yes.
You went back and you listened to it, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, you found out that it was said right before this, correct?
Yes.
And also, it wasn't that they were getting a citizen's arrest. It was they wanted to get a arrest warrant, right?
Yes.
So they weren't talking about, hey, let's get in the car, let's head over to the governor's house or the Capitol or wherever, because we think that she has broken the law and we're going to bust through the door and execute a citizen's arrest. That's not what they were talking about, right?
Well, it would have been a citizen's arrest with an arrest warrant. So, and they would have to bust through the door to do that.
Let me ask you this. You're a law enforcement officer, right?
Yes, sir.
If a judge signs an arrest warrant, a lawful judge, a sitting judge, signs a warrant that says, thou shalt, police officer, arrest this person, you have an obligation to arrest that person, correct?
Yes.
So now listen, you're an FBI agent, a lawyer, a judge is here. I think you and I can understand that it's going to be hard pressed to go find a conservative, sheriff to go to a conservative judge to get that conservative judge to sign an arrest warrant for the governor of the state. You would agree with me that that's a little far-fetched, right?
Yes, sir.
But their mind, that's what they were talking about, right?
It was certainly part of the discussion.
And it was a significant discussion, right?
Yes, that's a relative term. They talked about it. Ty Garbin brought it up. And it wasn't the first time that the group had talked about arresting the governor.
Let's listen to it. And what I'm going to be playing is going to be it's about 3.5 minutes, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
And I'm going to tell you, it's going to end with, here's another thing. So when we get to here's another thing, we know that this tape is going to be over because that's going to be the full conclusion of this.
I'm just trying to ask if that's going to be an exhibit, if it'll be admitted into evidence, because I believe if that's what he's trying to do, then if we could have it marked and all that other stuff that we do with every other exhibit.
Your Honor gave me authority to cross-examine on this. That's all I'm going to do. I'm just gonna
Right,
play
but
the jury.
that's for impeach. If he's using it for impeachment, it doesn't get admitted as an exhibit, but that's not what I'm understanding.
I'm not asking it to be.
happen. Excuse me, that's not what I'm understanding is happening right now. If he's gonna make this an exhibit and put it into evidence, then he's gotta follow the same rules we've all been following about laying a foundation and doing that. Just, I have no objection to it,
Sure,
Judge.
I'll lay a foundation.
I just need to understand what it is.
I'll lay a foundation. And actually, that Shopback meeting was reported by Dan, right?
Yes, sir.
That's on June 20th, correct?
Yes.
And at that shop vac meeting on June 20th, they also practice what you call OPSEC, right?
Yes,
So with OPSEC, that's where you gotta drop your phone in an ammo can or the bathroom or wherever, right?
yeah,
And unlike June 28th training, which we're gonna get to in a minute, unlike June 28th training, you were still able to get a recording in this case, correct?
yes,
And you monitored that recording, correct?
yes,
You listened to that recording, correct?
yes,
You kept that recording in your ordinary course of business, correct?
yes.
I think you had them under the US, what is it, USLR? What you have your recordings under when you saved them for discovery?
I call them LSHRP,
LSHRP.
electronic surveillance. That's, we've got acronyms for everything.
And that's for purposes of discovery, so when we come to court, we can have it, right?
Yes, sir.
And so that entire recording of this would be of you, that entire recording of this shop vac would be something that you would get in the ordinary course of business during your investigation, correct?
Yes, sir.
I move for the admission of defendant's exhibit AAA.
Great, no objection.
Well, he's admitted.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you, I got this, so if you can't hear it, if you could please let me know, I'll certainly bring it a little bit closer to you.
That is 100%. Never to iPhone. Connected.
As soon as like the second batch of executive orders came through, they just told the governor to go fucking pound sand. There are a couple on the east side of the state too.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear that okay? Anybody having fun here? More importantly, can you hear it okay?
Yes, sir.
Like, a few like sanctuary cities for like 2 a.m. Yeah, so Monroe, like Tennessee, Monroe's a sanctuary.
That's Dan as well engaging in this conversation about sanctuary cities, is that correct? Your Honor, may I bring the speaker up?
Go ahead.
also?
So the main speaker there was Ty Garbin. Somebody chimed in and I'll have to listen. Yeah, I didn't catch it.
I'll start.
As soon as like the second batch of executive orders came through, they just told the governor to go fucking pound sand. There are a couple on the east side of the state too, like, like sanctuary cities for like 2 a.m. Yeah, so Monroe, like Tennessee, Monroe's a sanctuary city now. But they're sanctuary cities, right? But they're still gonna arrest you for violating. Yeah.
And have they learned for arresting anybody?
They will. If you roll in the Genesee County with a unregistered machine gun, they're still gonna arrest you. So that whole 2A sanctuary shit is just. Yeah, because that's for the ones that you're allowed to have. Yeah. Well, allow you to have what violation. You know, with all that shit, that's just a sham. Like it's saying, all you need is like a peace officer and a judge from the same jurisdiction. Judge issues the warrant and the peace officer serves.
How
He goes inside, hey, with that, and just shows it. If he gets any resistance from the state police, they're automatically on the ballot for obstruction of justice. Continues on his way, goes to the governor's office, puts her in handcuffs while you have a group of armed protesters outside.
How do we find out what judges possibly be on our
You
side?
need to go to the smallest municipality, like bumfuck nowhere, Michigan justice. That are. Hey, I got nothing to do this. It sounds dumb to say it because we're centrist, but you need to find the most right-wing judge in Michigan you can.
That's what I'm saying. How do you find them? Like, what would you look
Just stick
for?
around. Just ask. Like, I'm not gonna find the cities, north. Go to Facebook, like go through all the militia groups and find out who knows, like what people in office. Don't be obvious. Start kind of maybe news articles, see if you can find judges that did interview, especially with the whole coronavirus thing. Like just start finding judges that were opposed to it. So you find those judges, just like write a letter to them or like call them up. Be like, hey, how do you feel about like what, give them just a list of problems. How do you feel about this? Do you feel that the governor should be like arrested for treason or obstruction of your constitutional right.
Here's another thing, is that I feel like if we're gonna be doing this, we probably get other.
Well, you agree, you just said, here's another thing, is that I feel like, so you agree that we're up to this exhibit, correct?
Yes, sir.
Nowhere in there. Does anyone talk about citizens arrest, correct? Citizens arrest, I'm not. They talked about getting an arrest warrant, correct?
Correct, but they're citizens, so I extrapolated that.
But they're not citizens. Not what they said in it. Did you hear what I just heard? Did he not say get a peace officer? Did you not hear him say get a peace officer?
Oh, yes, I did hear that. Yes,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Did you not hear him say go to a judge and get a warrant?
Yes,
Did you not hear him say take the peace officer with you? And if the MSP doesn't comply, they're violating a court order. Did you not hear that?
I did hear that.
So let me ask you again, this was not a citizen's arrest, correct? They were not discussing a citizen's arrest, correct?
I guess yes, I guess if there's a police officer there to effect the arrest, then it's not them doing the arrest. It would be that peace officer. So under those conditions, it wouldn't be a citizen's arrest.
Thank you. And that's what they're sitting there discussing, right?
Yes, sir.
And much like the intent that you talked about repeatedly and repeatedly, it's difficult for you and I to speculate whether they believe they can even do it or not during that conversation, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. A couple things I forgot to get out. You talked about some memes, and I apologize, ladies and gentlemen, I got to go back in time just for a minute. We talked about a couple memes in the beginning, and I'm referring to Exhibit 49.
I have it here.
Perfect. This is the meme where Mr. Beller is saying, guys, she still extended it this time to the 28th. And then Boogaloo Bunyan says, and she's getting sued. I think that someone was filing a lawsuit against her. Did you know anything about that? Maybe not.
No, so this is a screen capture of an encrypted wire chat.
Right.
And
then he says she needs to be dragged to the streets and hung. I knew this shit was gonna happen, right? That's what he says, right?
Yes, sir.
To your knowledge, he never threatened to go to the governor's house and hang her from the tree, right? To your knowledge.
Correct. I mean, this is what he said, and I don't have other statements about hanging her.
Well, she extended it, didn't she?
Yes.
He didn't hang her, did he?
No, he did not.
He also put up another exhibit, another meme or regarding the Maltel cocktail, which is 1 second. There it is. You don't need this one. It's Exhibit 39. You recall testifying about that? I don't remember what day it was, but you testified about. It says,
Yes.
legislator just stopped at my girl's restaurant and told her that Gretchen is extending the order until the end of May. Were you aware that his girlfriend's family owned that restaurant? Were you aware of that?
No.
Okay. You agree with me during that time period, there was a lot of people that were frustrated, right?
Absolutely.
You agree with me during that time period that there were people losing their businesses, right?
Yes.
Losing their homes, right?
Yes.
Couldn't go to work, right?
Yes.
And so Doc, my client, Mr. Bella, says, I swear to God, if this is true, I'm gonna Molotov her fucking house. I'm so fucking done with it.
Correct.
Throughout your entire investigation, from beginning to end, you have no personal knowledge and or evidence or anything to support that he's ever even made a Molotov cocktail, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, he didn't call the Capitol to say, I'm gonna do this, right?
Correct.
He didn't call the governor's house and do it, right?
Correct.
He goes on to say too, I'm serious. I'm honestly about to snap. I can't afford to miss 1 month's rent, let alone a whole another effing month. She's about to make me go homeless. In fact, she did make him go homeless, right?
Right?
He was eventually evicted.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You testified that he was evicted, which is why he left the state of Michigan, right?
Yeah, he said he wanted to live with his dad. He wanted to pursue some other opportunities, but ultimately he ran out of money.
Okay, and we'll get to that later, but when he did end up homeless, he didn't go try to Molotov cocktail at the governor's house, correct?
Not to my knowledge.
He left the state of Michigan, right?
Yes, sir.
And when he did, he hadn't been arrested for anything or charged with any crimes, correct? So the next event is June 28th. You know what I mean? We approach.
Well, the next part of Mr. Patrick's cross is going to be probably 45 minutes to an hour.
Well, I'm sorry, Judge, I didn't mean to interrupt the court. Just so they can kind of know, I'll probably go maybe an hour and 10 minutes, an hour and 15 minutes. I don't want them to think they're going to be
So,
sitting
and-
through days of testimony.
In fairness to the defense, he doesn't want to break that line of questioning up, get you through 15, 20 minutes of it, stop, come back and have you trying to remember everything that was going on at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and